In 1821, Mexico gains independence from Spain and now stretches from the Oregon territories in the northwest to the Gulf of Mexico in the southeast. Meanwhile, the United States has expanded its borders through the Louisiana Purchase and settlement in the former indigenous territories. Fueled by mass migration, the U.S. population explodes from 2 million in 1780 to 12 million in 1830. Mexico is racked by tensions between centralists who want to focus power among the conservatives in Mexico City and federalists who want more autonomy for state governors. These struggles, including frequent changes in government, mean Mexico's far-flung territories are sparsely developed. So some U.S. settlers cross the border and establish new towns on Mexican territory, especially in Coahuila y Texas, or as the American settlers call it, Texas. In 1821, Mexico had granted permission for U.S. settlers in Texas as long as they adopt Mexican citizenship and Roman Catholicism. Although early arrivals often respect Mexican laws, later settlers rarely integrate or convert. Many also bring slaves, illegal in Mexico since 1829, or refuse to register firearms under Mexican law. Soon, U.S. citizens in Texas greatly outnumber Mexicans. In 1834, the centralist Antonio López de Santana becomes Mexican president. He leads an army north to regain control over the unruly Texans, but instead they rise in armed insurrection in 1836. Texan militias led by Sam Houston capture several Mexican towns before Santana mobilizes reinforcements and besieges the Alamo, a fortified convent in San Antonio. 2,800 Mexican troops then storm the Alamo, killing all the defenders, including frontiersmen Davy Crockett and Jim Bowen. But Mexican success is short-lived. During the battle, Texas declares itself an independent republic. Santana's army advances, but Texan forces capture him in an ambush at San Jacinto in April 1836. On May 14th, he recognizes the Republic of Texas in exchange for his own release. Santana returns to Mexico and renounces the treaty, claiming he signed under duress. After a short exile, he wins a fifth term as president in 1839, but his centralist policies spark several provinces to declare short-lived independence. Mexico is unstable, but the Texan Republic is vulnerable as well. Mexico's military potential dwarfs that of Texas, and they still disagree on the border. Texas claims territory down to the Rio Grande River, while Mexico claims territory up to the Nueces River. Indigenous tribes like the Comanche are active in the region and contribute to tensions. After a campaign of raids in Texas, Sam Houston makes peace with the Comanches in 1844, who then raid more into Mexico. Mexico accuses Texas of facilitating the raids, especially as the Comanche trades stolen horses and livestock to Texans in exchange for guns. Texas looks abroad for support, including to Britain, but soon talk turns to U.S. annexation. Many Texans favor a U.S. takeover for both security and cultural reasons, but the issue is divisive in the United States. The Democratic Party generally supports annexation, while the Whig Party, which includes many abolitionists, opposes it. Northern Whigs fear the addition of a large slave-holding state could upset the delicate political balance between free and slave states. Santana also threatens war if the U.S. annexes Texas. In March 1845, the new Democratic president and ardent expansionist James K. Polk pushes annexation through Congress, and Texas becomes the 28th state. In Mexico, uprisings against Santana's dictatorial regime have forced him back into exile, but his successors say they're still willing to go to war over annexation. With tensions high, Polk sends General Zachary Taylor and 4,000 troops, which is around half of the U.S. Army, from their camp at Corpus Christi to the Rio Grande in February 1846. Taylor, known as Old Rough and Ready for his casual style, is popular with the rank and file, although at least one German immigrant in an Illinois regiment is unimpressed. Taylor is short and very heavy, with pronounced face lines and gray hair, wears an old oilcloth cap, a dusty green coat, a frightful pair of trousers, and on horseback, looks like a toad. After Mexican General Pedro de Ampudia demands U.S. troops withdraw to the Nueces, Taylor orders a detachment of dragoons to reconnoiter Mexican positions. On April 26th, Mexican forces ambushed the U.S. riders at a ranch in the disputed border zone. killing about a dozen and capturing the rest. Taylor informs Polk on May 10th. Hostilities may now be considered as commenced. The border dispute has drawn blood. Polk asked Congress for a declaration of war, citing not only the ranch attack, but also Mexico's failure to pay reparations for U.S. property damage in Mexico's War of Independence against Spain decades before. President Polk tells Congress, "The cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of the Rio Grande. But now, after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil." But not all agree with the president, especially anti-war Whigs like Joshua Giddings of Ohio. In the murder of Mexicans upon their own soil, or in robbing them of their country, I can take no part either now or hereafter. The guilt of these crimes must rest on others. I will not participate in them. A young congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, challenges Polk to explain exactly where U.S. blood was spilled. Even so, many anti-war Whigs eventually do vote for war. This is partly due to Polk's refusal to separate a declaration of war from other practical defense measures, as well as widespread public support for action against Mexico. Others want to spread U.S. political ideals. The questions of war and slavery are only incidental ones, which can easily be pushed aside. But the question of extending constitutional Republican institutions over this whole continent is one of the broadest, noblest, and most important that was ever presented to any nation. The Declaration, signed May 13, 1846, orders a doubling of the regular army and raising 50,000 volunteers. This is vital as Mexico's 40,000 troops greatly outnumber the U.S. Army. In 1846, the U.S. has around 7,500 regular troops, plus militias. The tiny army means many men avoid a career in the military because of a lack of promotion opportunities, poor pay, and harsh conditions. As a result, 47% of regular troops are immigrants, especially Irish and Germans like Frederick C. Love for my new homeland was definitely not the reason I became a soldier. My 6 to 7 month stay in the United States certainly instilled no patriotism in me. When natives felt well disposed towards us Germans, they thought it flattering to call us sauerkraut. Usually, they labeled us the goddamn Dutch. This asinine rebuff considerably dampened my ardor for becoming a soldier. However, the promise of regular pay, food, and accommodation appeals to those with few options. Some commanders have experience fighting indigenous tribes, but few have fought a large standing army, and some are appointed for political reasons. One soldier complains about Polk ally General Gideon Pillow. Pillow is about as consummate an ass as any army, modern or ancient, has ever been inflicted with. Most U.S. troops are armed with flintlock muzzleloaders, although some have percussion-capped muskets. The U.S. military has excellent light artillery and new tactics for their use. Samuel Ringgold pioneers mobile, horse-drawn flying artillery, and the Army has skilled engineers and surveyors. The U.S.'s stronger industrial economy also means it's better prepared economically than Mexico. Meanwhile, in Mexico, soldiering was traditionally considered a noble profession with strong unit identities, but by 1846, it has suffered from revolts and disunity. Talented officers are purged for political reasons, and some commanders are unreliable. For example, in December 1845, General Mariano Paredes moves his troops not north towards the border, but south and takes over the government. The need for troops to respond to internal political threats limits mobilization. Equipment is also lacking. Most Mexican infantrymen carry outdated muskets, including discarded British models from the Peninsular War, which are inaccurate and prone to fouling.
Hi guys, Jonathan Ferguson here, Keeper of Firearms and Artillery at the Royal Armouries Museum in the UK. And thank you so much to Real Time History for asking me to come on and talk a bit about this, the India pattern musket. So that's a modern name. At the time, they'd have just called it the Land Service musket, or Land Service pattern. It is a simplified design of the already quite old Brown Bess, flintlock musket as used by the British from about 1700. First pattern is 1730 and it becomes standardized. And they get ever simpler. The big leap in simplification to make these things quicker and easier and less costly to make was borrowing this design, this basic design, from the East India Company. That's why it's called the India pattern musket. And I gather that the Mexican army was primarily equipped with these British muskets, which is really interesting. But they had some problems, and I think those problems are going to primarily stem from just how old these things would have been by 1846. So this pattern with the S-shaped cock here, that comes in 1797, and there's an improved, strengthened version of that cock that is on the later version from 1810. So I don't know which specific variant the Mexicans were using, quite likely both. I'd love to dig into more of how they got these things and all the details. But 3 million of these get made because of the Napoleonic Wars primarily. So there'll be a lot floating around, available to other countries. Portugal, for example, makes extensive use of British pattern flintlock stuff, and it turns out Mexico as well. So they are physically going to be worn out, quite likely, depending on, obviously, how much use they see. The guys have told me that at least one musket had the barrel held in with a leather thong. If it's got that problem going on up here, I dread to think what's going on ignition-wise. And that's another problem that we know they ran into, guns failing to go off. Part of that is poor quality powder, I'm told. And overcharging is going on as well. Now that stands to reason. If your powder isn't producing enough of a bang, you're going to try and put more in to remedy that. All that's going to do is make the fouling worse. Now, at the best of times, so this is an excellent weapon when it's in decent condition, it's well maintained, it's not raining. Fouling is always a problem. So black powder, it's not like modern gunpowder, it burns very dirtily. Tons of carbon is left behind when it burns. So that will coat the pan, it goes everywhere, coats you. The bore will, if you shoot enough shots, will start to constrict and make loading more difficult. This is why, so this is a 75 caliber weapon, 0.75 of an inch, but the bullet was about 0.69 of an inch in a paper cartridge, and the paper forms a sort of a sabot cup around the ball and keeps it accurate enough for 100 yards-ish. But it gives it enough windage so that the fouling isn't a big problem. But if you've got cheap powder, low quality powder that's burning even more dirty, and you're putting more in to try and compensate, you might even have issues with loading the thing. You're certainly going to get reduced velocity, reduced effect. What little accuracy it does have at 100 yards is going to degrade. But then, even more critical than that is the touch hole. So in there is a hole. You get the flash in the pan here, little bit of powder you put in from your cartridge before you load everything down the front. That has to be able to flash through this hole into the chamber to fire the main charge. If it can't, you're just going to get the flash in the pan. Hence the expression, flash in the pan. So how do you avoid that? Well, you can't fully. This little hole will narrow as it gets caked up with fouling. If you were in a sustained firefight, you would get a pricker, sharp, pointy thing, jam it in there and remove some of the fouling, and that will unblock the hole and you can carry on shooting. I don't know if these guys had the training, the knowledge to do that. I don't know if they had access to a pricker or a suitable improvised tool to do that. If you don't, you're just going to be flashing in the pan for the rest of the battle, and no bullets are going to be coming out. Well, this is our shooting example, over 200 years old, that we actually do occasionally shoot. Sean Bean has shot this one.
The power of a musket is terrifying at close range.
And so this is at half cock, bullets are full cock, and I'll just do this for once. Hopefully you saw a bit of sparking there. These flints have a limited lifespan. Routinely they would have been swapped out. And this is the thing, logistics. This is a simple mechanism, a spring, a piece of flint, hardened steel here. As long as it's kept in working order, it's reliable, it's going to go. We have had no misfires with this thing. We've put a handful of shots through it every couple of years. Never has it failed us, unless the flint broke when it came to the end of its natural life. You've got to install this flint at the right angle. It's got to be made in a precise, consistent way so that all the geometry works, so it strikes at the right point here, scrapes down without breaking, without excessively wearing, and creates enough sparks to set the thing off. You just stick a piece of stone in there and off you go. No, it has to be extremely precise to work consistently, reliably over a period of years. If you don't have that logistical and that training setup, that doctrine, that culture, you've got guys who haven't even shot a gun before, that's going to cause you serious problems. So nothing inherently wrong with the design. The 1777 patent fans in the comments can argue, but this is a very sound basic design. The other thing, of course, is the bayonet. It's a single shot weapon, as most were at this time. When you're ordered to, you would fix bayonets. You can still load and fire if you need to, but then you're using it as essentially a small pike. That's pretty key to the weapon system. So really, the problems that the Mexicans are experiencing are generic to a flintlock musket, and that would include poor weather, hopefully not a problem here. Not specific to the British musket, but it's really fascinating that it was the British India pattern that ended up in Mexican hands against the United States.
Mexico also mostly uses older Spanish cannons based on Napoleonic Gribeauval carriages with low-quality ammunition. Mexican cavalry, though, are highly skilled horsemen, but they suffer from a lack of coordination with infantry and artillery. The cavalry was drilled only in regiments. The artillery hardly ever maneuvered and never fired a blank shot. The general in command was never present on the field of maneuvers, so that he was unable to appreciate the respective qualities of the various bodies under his command. Geography also plays a role. The US can rapidly move troops and supplies via the Mississippi and its superior navy in the Gulf of Mexico, while Mexican troops must cross harsh desert-like conditions on foot to reach the front. Although Mexico can quickly raise large armies, it struggles to feed them, and armies often depend on camp followers like their wives and mothers for supplies. A reporter describes the so-called soldaderas. The woman of 60 or more years, the mother with her infant wrapped in her rebosa, the wife, the youthful señorita frisking along with her lover's sombrero upon her head, even the prattling girl who'd followed padre and madre to the wars. Mexican commanders tried to limit female camp followers to modernize logistics and remove women from harm, but they don't develop a viable alternative, and soldaderas also function as foragers, cooks, and nurses. The women also help to prevent desertion, which remains common due to irregular pay. Mexican officers often avoid aggressive maneuvers so they can keep their troops under close supervision. But desertion is not just a Mexican problem. Before hostilities open, around 200 US troops defect. Many joined the artillery-focused San Patricio Battalion, most of which is Catholic and 40% of which is Irish. Mexico offers incentives for defectors, although US anti-Catholic sentiment also contributes. Polk hopes his declaration of war and a $10 million war chest will quickly mobilize a new army. But even before his May 13th declaration, decisive battles are being fought. On May 1st, Taylor marches with 2,200 men from Fort Texas to secure his supply depot at Point Isabel. Mexican General Mariano Arista, now the only Mexican army in the north after Paredes moves south, intercepts Taylor on the return journey at Palo Alto on May 8th. Arista outnumbers Taylor 2-1, but he stays on the defensive and the battle becomes an artillery duel. Older Mexican guns fall short, allowing US troops to dodge cannonballs rolling towards them. Meanwhile, US flying artillery advances and fires quickly. At the end of the day, Mexican troops withdraw with 100 killed and 120 wounded. US casualties are 9 killed and 44 wounded, including the mortally wounded Ringgold. Arista reforms his army at Resaca de la Palma, a dried-up tributary of the Rio Grande. The 1.2-meter deep ravine is a natural trench, and the area is covered in chaparral, dense scrubland with thorny shrubs. Brigadier General Romulo Diaz de la Vega later stated, "If I had with me $100,000 in silver, I would have bet the whole of it that no 10,000 men on Earth could drive us from our position. But Mexican troops are exhausted and hungry, while the dense vegetation limits artillery fire, though of course this affects both sides. Mexican artillery forces back a US light infantry vanguard on the road. At 4 p.m., the rest of Taylor's army arrives. Now US artillery firing grape shot prevents a Mexican cavalry charge and pushes the Mexicans back to the other side of the ravine. US troops advance through the chaparral, a type of engagement favoring small units led by aggressive officers like Ulysses S. Grant, then a regimental quartermaster. The balls commence to whistle very thick overhead, cutting the limbs of the chaparral right and left. We could not see the enemy, so I ordered the men to lie down, an order that did not have to be enforced. A group of US infantry worked their way around the Mexican left flank, capturing guns and approaching Arista's tent. As the Mexican left collapses, US dragoons charge straight through Mexican lines, capturing De la Vega. But the American cavalry cannot capture the guns, so US infantry move up for hand-to-hand fighting. The US troops repel a last-ditch cavalry charge by Arista, and Mexican troops flee the field. This first major infantry battle costs Mexico 154 killed, 205 wounded, and 156 missing, around 15% casualties. US losses are 49 killed and 83 wounded, around 9%. After US victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, Taylor crosses the Rio Grande and occupies Matamoros without a fight. As his troops enter Mexico, fresh opportunities for American expansion open up elsewhere. Although publicly Polk only talks about acquiring Oregon and Texas, privately he also wants Mexican California and New Mexico. Northern Alta California is sparsely settled with around 5,000 non-indigenous people, including 4,000 of Hispanic origin and 400 US, mostly in religious missions. The trickle of US settlers into California stands in contrast to previous years of Mexican settlement stagnation. In April 1846, just before the US declares war, Governor José Castro orders US settlers to leave. Instead, a handful of Americans in Sonoma revolt with the aid of Mexican settlers known as Californios, who also oppose his governorship. The rebels become known as the Bear Flaggers after their flag. The Bear Flaggers are soon joined by John C. Fremont, a US officer conducting a Pacific Coast survey with 60 armed civilians. While in Oregon, he receives vague orders regarding Polk's intentions in California and moves south. However, he assists the Bear Flaggers without direct orders from Washington. On July 7th, US Commodore John D. Sloat helps Fremont by blockading Mexican ports and occupying San Francisco and Monterrey with Marines. He assumes Fremont is acting with orders and is disturbed when he learns otherwise. Sloat resigns due to illness, and his successor, Commodore Robert Stockton, willingly continues to help Fremont. Together, they form the Californian Battalion and move south, occupying coastal towns. On August 13th, US troops capture Los Angeles, and Stockton proclaims all of Alta California to be US territory. However, by September 1846, around 100 Mexican Californios recapture Los Angeles from the 48 US troops left to defend it, partly because the Californios resent harsh US-imposed laws in the town. So far, the fighting across California has been small-scale, but US General Stephen Kearny's Army of the West is on the way, with 1,500 volunteers, including many frontiersmen and 500 Mormon settlers. After leaving Fort Leavenworth, they march 1,600 kilometers in just 6 weeks, along trails previously established by American traders. In some cases, traders have good relationships with Mexican civic leaders, which allows Kearny to occupy Santa Fe without a fight and proclaim himself governor of New Mexico. He then hears California is secure, so he dispatches some forces to attack into Chihuahua and continues to California with only 100 men, a decision he soon regrets. He finds Los Angeles in Mexican hands and hastily attacks with exhausted troops at San Pascual on December 6th. Mexican lancers beat them back, killing 18 Americans and wounding 13, including Kearny. Mexican General José María Flores counterattacks to disrupt US preparations, but is defeated at San Gabriel and La Mesa. Now greatly weakened, the Mexican commanders surrender Los Angeles, meaning the Americans have conquered Alta California. But they have done so without official orders, and friction ensues since Kearny and Fremont both claim governorship. Stockton supports Fremont, but Polk intervenes in favor of Kearny. In just over 6 months, with only a few hundred troops, the US claims about 1 million square kilometers of territory, 100,000 new citizens, most of Mexican descent, and an estimated 150,000 indigenous people. The American victories of May 1846 also caused shockwaves in Mexico, which is destabilized by rivalries among generals and the question of expropriating church property to fund the war. In July, troops depose Mexican President Mariano Paredes, who had just seized power in January. His replacement is also quickly overthrown in favor of General José Mariano Salas, an ally of the exiled Santana, who plans his return amidst the chaos. Santana now positions himself as a moderate and tells the Americans he will finally accept Texan annexation if the US Navy allows him to return to Mexico through their blockade. The US agrees, and by August 1846, Santana is back in Mexico. However, once he's back in power, Santana breaks his word. He gathers 25,000 troops to push Taylor's army out of Mexico. Taylor's force has also grown with large numbers of volunteers, but this causes problems. Firstly, many arrive unarmed, adding a logistical burden. More importantly, many are untrained, and by the time they've been mustered, outfitted, and sent to the front, there's little time for drill. The fact that they elect their own officers also means leadership is often poor, which adds to discipline problems. These only worsen once US forces enter Mexico, as a regular officer complains. They plunder the poor inhabitants of everything they can lay their hands on, and shoot them when they remonstrate. This is the true picture, and the cause is the utter incapacity of their officers to control them or command respect. There are also tensions with regular troops, who are better trained and disciplined, but from lower social classes than the volunteers. Some volunteers struggle with the reality of army life, especially those accustomed to easier living. Inactivity, camp chores, and harsh discipline produce disillusionment, boredom, and frustration. For many homesick volunteers, alcohol becomes a crutch. One soldier's reflection is also an example of the varied level of literacy among the men. It always was against my principle to drink when I was home, although I have altered my notion now, for it is a great help to a man's health and also to drown trouble. For when a man is about half drunk, there is nothing on his mind, only good things. He imagines every button on his coat is gold. 361 US soldiers die in camp accidents throughout the war, many caused by poor discipline and alcohol. Desertion remains a constant problem, with rates reaching almost 10%. Volunteers are especially prone, sometimes due to the fear of missing out on employment or social opportunities back home. Although volunteers from towns and cities are of variable quality, some volunteers do perform well. Frontiersmen are skilled in scouting and hunting, while specific volunteer groups from close-knit communities like the Mormons are better disciplined and motivated. However, as men gather at makeshift forts, there's another deadly problem: disease. General Taylor pays little attention to sanitation, so typhus, cholera, and dysentery incapacitate many men. Volunteers unused to the rigors of campaigning are especially vulnerable. I have seen more suffering since I came out here than I could have imagined to exist. It is really awful. I allude to the sufferings of the volunteers. They literally die like dogs. Polk now orders Taylor and his larger army to advance further into Mexico to force the Mexicans to surrender on American terms. The Mexicans shift to a defensive strategy. They still significantly outnumber the Americans and hope that they can defeat or exhaust them far from home. Taylor has 12,000 troops, including 7,700 volunteers, only half of whom are combat ready. With 6,000 troops, he marches on Monterrey, which is defended by 7,000 Mexicans under General Ampudia. The city has several forts and tactically important hills on its outskirts. However, they're spread out, and manning them limits Ampudia's reserve. Taylor plans to launch a diversionary attack against the forts in the east and the main assault against the high ground in the west under General William Worth. Taylor hopes to split the defenders, but difficulties coordinating the two attacks mean that Mexican defenders discover Worth's units on September 20th. With his cover blown, Worth repels a Mexican cavalry charge and on September 21st assaults Federation Hill. After Texas Rangers scout a path, US troops take the position by storm after a short fight. But US forces struggle in the east. Although originally a diversionary attack, eager officers try to take Fort Teneria by direct assault. Mexican troops in Black Fort and Teneria rake the Americans with fire and inflict heavy casualties. Some US regulars reached Monterrey's outskirts but lose their way in urban fighting. US reinforcements arrive but come under heavy fire as the Mexicans have already routed the first wave. Eventually, a brigade under General John Quitman attacks from another direction, taking the fort after heavy fighting. It's the only American success in the east and costs around 400 US casualties. A Tennessee regular claims he was the first over Fort Teneria's parapet in a letter home. I discharged my pistol at a Mexican and guess nothing but the bells and bones was found. He instantly fell. He was trying to load the cannon, but he was too late. I sent him to another world. Fighting resumes early on September 22nd. On Federation Hill, US troops fire captured guns onto Independence Hill in support of an assault on Fort Libertad. Surprised Mexican defenders engage in a short hand-to-hand fight before falling back to the Bishop's Palace. After a failed Mexican counterattack, US troops complete the capture of Independence Hill. In the east, Taylor waits for a Mexican counterattack. When none comes, he orders a renewed advance on September 23rd from both directions. Mexican resistance is weakening, but urban fighting is dangerous to troops and civilians. The street fight became appalling. The artillery of both sides raked the streets. Doors were forced open, walls were battered down, and the enemy driven from room to room and from house to house, followed by the shrieks of women and the sharp crack of Texian rifles. It was indeed a most strange and novel scene of warfare. The next morning, Amphibious surrenders after the bloodiest fighting yet, with 500 US and 360 Mexican casualties. Under the terms, Amphibious withdraws with all small arms and horses, followed by an 8-week ceasefire. Washington is upset at what it sees as Taylor's lenient terms, but it gives US troops time to rest and resupply. The surrender agreement does not prevent further bloodshed, though. US troops, especially Texas Rangers, ransack the city, burn homes, loot, kill civilians, and rape women until officers take control. Taylor highlights the harsh nature of the campaigning in Mexico, although he accepts that this did not excuse the crimes. The rampage increases criticism of the war in the US and leads to Mexican guerrilla attacks against Taylor's forces. A US officer reports on the aftermath of one such attack. The bodies are strewn from this place 2 or 3 miles. These bodies are the wagoners and men under command of Lieutenant Barber. They were attacked on a side hill, and the massacre continued throughout the entire length of the train. Meanwhile, Mexican priests encourage resistance by claiming Americans will desecrate Catholic churches if they're not stopped. The US hopes that since it now controls much of northern Mexico, the Mexicans will surrender, but the ceasefire ends without negotiations. Instead, Polk develops plans to capture Mexico City for a decisive victory. Taylor's depleted force is too far away and separated from the Mexican capital by a large desert, so Polk orders US Commander-in-Chief General Winfield Scott to take over the war effort. Taylor is unhappy, since he has to give up most of his troops to Scott. Compared to Taylor's casual style, Scott is a strict adherent to military standards, earning him the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers. The decision to switch commander, though, is partly political. The Democrat Polk is disappointed with Taylor's ceasefire agreement with Amphibious, and both Taylor and Scott are Whigs. With war heroes often becoming presidents later, Polk doesn't want any single Whig general to gain too much prestige. Already, his failure to end the war is attracting criticism. With most of Taylor's healthy troops, Scott now plans to launch an amphibious invasion of Veracruz, already blockaded by US forces, but needs to move quickly to avoid the coastal yellow fever season. Santana learns of the US plan through intercepted messages. He realizes Taylor is weak, so he plans a knockout blow in the north before turning to defend Veracruz. Santana drives his new army of 21,000 men hard through harsh terrain. Today you commence your march through thinly settled country without supplies and without provisions. But you may be assured that very quickly you will be in possession of those of your enemy and of his riches, and with them all your wants will be superabundantly supplied. Despite this promise, he loses around 4,000 men to disease and desertion before arriving near Monterrey. Taylor learns of Santana's move north and sets up a defensive position at Buena Vista. The Mexicans attack, and their cavalry nearly drives the Americans from their positions. But the US's fast, maneuverable artillery and Mexican failure to coordinate their cavalry attacks with infantry lead to a costly Mexican defeat. They suffer 2,700 casualties, mostly missing, for around 650 US casualties. The defeat means Santana cannot repel Scott's invasion. On March 9, 1847, Scott lands 12,000 troops unopposed and quickly besieges Veracruz. After 3 weeks of bombardment and American promises for a disciplined occupation, the town surrenders on March 29th. Scott rapidly moves his troops inland along the well-maintained national highway towards Mexico City. Santana tries to make a stand at Cerro Gordo with 12,000 men, but he leaves some key hills undefended on the assumption that they're too steep for positioning artillery. U.S. engineers, though, including Captain Robert E. Lee, develop a conveyor system to move men and guns up these hills. The next day, U.S. forces attacked the Mexicans from 3 directions, causing heavy losses and forcing Santana to withdraw. The Americans also kill many of the Mexican camp followers, including women, as a U.S. trooper recalls. The most distressing of all was the sight of hundreds of dead soldaderas scattered among the bodies of their men. Scott has won at Cerro Gordo, but he's vulnerable. Like Taylor in the north, Mexican guerrillas are harassing Scott's supply lines, so he calls in troops experienced in the brutal counterinsurgency from Taylor's theater. Disease is also taking a toll again. Polk is appalled by Scott's supposed great military error, while foreign observer, the Duke of Wellington, comments, "Scott is lost. He cannot capture Mexico City, and he cannot fall back upon his base." Scott establishes a new base at the major town of Puebla, and reinforcements bring his army up to 14,000, 4,000 of whom are sick. Much to the surprise of his generals, he stops at Puebla for 10 weeks. It is utterly inconceivable that a population of this kind should inhabit such a beautiful and well-built city. Santana raises another army, but withdraws to defend the approaches to Mexico City and drum up popular resistance. National Guardsmen from across the country concentrate in the Valley of Mexico, but low pay and commitments from back home create frustration. Hard-working and honest artisans have abandoned their houses and families because they believed they would be here only a month at most. But when they see that combat is postponed and their families suffer the consequences, they will be able to do nothing except abandon the cause they embraced with such good faith. Even so, when Scott advances on August 7, 1847, Santana has around 30,000 troops. Many are around El Peñón, a heavily fortified position covering causeways passing through flooded fields. But Scott diverts his forces south towards weaker defenses around the Pedregal, an area of broken volcanic rock. As Santana moves south to defend San Antonio, he orders political rival General Gabriel Valencia to fall back to the village of San Angel with his 5,000 men and 22 guns. But Valencia ignores orders and forms a defense in the hills overlooking Pandiena, assuming the Pedregal to be impassable. U.S. engineers, though, expand a mule path through the volcanic rock, which allows U.S. troops to get behind Valencia. When Valencia hears the news, he reportedly replies, "No, you're dreaming, man." Some U.S. forces distract Valencia with a frontal attack, while others move through ravines into his camp. The Americans fire one volley and charge at the bayonet, scattering the Mexicans. Mexico loses 700 killed, 1,200 wounded, and 850 captured, including 4 generals. U.S. casualties are around 300. Santana now withdraws to a crossing at the Churubusco River, protected by a fortified monastery, earthworks, and a small moat. Scott orders a hasty pursuit, but his troops lack advanced scouting and strong artillery support. Mexican soldiers defeat a flanking attack and pour heavy fire onto the Americans' frontal assaults. A Mexican observer noted, "The Yankees died like ants." Mexican defenders, including the San Patricio Battalion, repel several attacks, but ammunition runs low and guns foul. The bridge falls to the Americans, who can now attack the monastery from two directions. After 3 hours, Mexican troops in the monastery surrender. The US have lost 137 killed, 865 wounded, and 38 missing, around 12% of the total force. Mexican casualties are unknown, but are likely around 1,000, with 2,000 more captured. Despite the losses, Santana successfully withdraws most of his forces to Mexico City, and the Americans are in no state to pursue. With both sides exhausted, they sign another truce on August 24th, but it collapses in just 2 weeks. Santana uses the time to prepare to defend Mexico City. Scott's options are limited. Flooded fields force US troops along elevated causeways towards Mexico City's fortified gates. Mexican troops also take up positions around Chapultepec Castle, Mexico's military academy. On September 8th, the Americans attack El Molino del Rey, a series of buildings reportedly being used to produce cannons near the base of Chapultepec. General Worth mistakenly thinks the position is abandoned and rushes in. Mexican troops open fire at close range, decimating the first US wave before counterattacking. But again, they struggle to coordinate cavalry and infantry. The US brings up artillery, Mexican ammo runs low, and the Mexicans withdraw. The US takes about 800 casualties, and the Mexicans perhaps 2,000. US troops discover that there was no cannon factory. The US now advance on Chapultepec Hill, protected by 800 Mexicans, including 50 teenaged officer cadets. The US bombards the position on September 12th, and the next day, American troops storm the hill from 3 directions with scaling ladders. A Mexican battery on the Tacubaya Road opens fire, which temporarily halts one assault column. Defenders also push down ladders and fire on US troops from above, wounding General Pillow and many others. As US troops crest the walls, they take few prisoners, and the battle becomes a hand-to-hand struggle as Mexican muskets break down. American troops kill most of the Mexican defenders, and 6 cadets go down in legend as boy heroes for refusing to surrender. The last to die, Juan Escutia, reportedly wraps himself in the garrison flag before jumping or falling from the roof, but there's no reliable evidence for the story. With Chapultepec captured, the US quickly assaults the isolated San Cosme and Belen gates. Mexican defenders repel the first attacks, but US artillery breaches the walls, and the US infantry advance on San Cosme under cover of an aqueduct. After roughly 2 hours, the Americans have secured the gates. By the end of the day, they suffer 850 casualties to roughly 3,000 Mexican. On September 14th, US troops enter Mexico City. Santana has already withdrawn, taking around 5,000 troops to join up with 7,000 more outside the city. In the city, local residents and Mexican National Guardsmen who stay behind attack US troops, especially in poorer districts. Priests again encourage resistance. A monk from the convent of Merced is going around on horseback, brandishing a lance, exhorting the people to rise up against the American army that is already occupying this capital. Other clerics are doing more or less the same. They keep urging the people to defend themselves and exhorting them to make war. But the city is not united. Wealthier residents worry about damage to their property, so they oppose further resistance and offer support to Scott. The shooting was neither started nor sustained by the respectable people of this capital, but instead by a few from the lower people without noble sentiments. By September 15th, the fighting dies down. Santana does not try to return to Mexico City and instead orders an attack on vulnerable US units at Puebla, but this plan is prevented by US reinforcements arriving from Veracruz. The remnants of Santana's last army disperse, and except for continued guerrilla resistance, the Mexican-American War is over. As news of victory in Mexico City arrives in Washington, some US leaders like Secretary of State James Buchanan and Vice President George M. Dallas push for annexing all of Mexico. But most lawmakers and soldiers just want the war to end. The US and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848. The treaty grants the United States Alta California and New Mexico an area of 1.3 million square kilometers and more than half of Mexico's total territory. It also confirms the Rio Grande as the border. But the US also agrees to pay $15 million for the territories, help Mexican reconstruction, and forgive all Mexican debt. The US must also work to stop the Comanche raids from the US into Mexico and end the sale of stolen Mexican property. Some in the US are outraged, but its supporters claim it restores relations between neighbors. By this time, Polk has negotiated a treaty with Britain regarding the US-Canadian border in Oregon, meaning by May 1848, the borders of the contiguous United States are largely those of today. The US mobilized over 100,000 men and conducted a major campaign with little experience in major interstate war. Of this number, 13,768 US soldiers died during the conflict, the vast majority from disease. The 13% mortality rate is the highest of any US war. The war also cost around $100,000 at the time, although California soon proved to be incredibly wealthy in gold, spurring on the settlement of the West. The war also forges future US leaders. Taylor becomes president in 1848, as will wartime officer Franklin Pierce in 1853. Ulysses S. Grant, who will become president in 1869, will later be critical of the conflict. It was the most unjust war ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. Mexican casualties are harder to estimate, but are likely around 5,000 killed in battle, with an unknown number wounded or dying from disease. The war also worsened the country's economic decline, political tensions, and internal conflict, which would continue into the 20th century. At the time, many Americans saw their victory as the triumph of a superior political and cultural system over a dysfunctional Mexican one. Many have since argued US triumphalism, combined with ideas of racial and religious superiority, grew into the concept of manifest destiny. The idea the US almost had a duty, perhaps God-given, to dominate the continent. The idea of manifest destiny, though, has been challenged. American expansionism was probably more diverse and opposed than commonly portrayed, including by some who did believe in American racial supremacy. Few US officers described the war as any kind of racial, political, or religious crusade, but did worry about promotions or returning home. We have so many married officers who are crazy to get back to their families that their continued grumbling renders the rest of us nervous. Still, US divisions during the war affected Congress and the press more than the army at the front. On the other hand, frequent internal conflicts between Mexican leaders and generals did weaken their army. Contrary to popular belief, many Mexicans did rally to their nation's defense, but as the war dragged on and resources dwindled, it became harder to wage effective war. Economic disparity also played a critical role. The US was able to rapidly raise war funds, while Mexico, cut off from trade via the American blockade, could not. Attempts to raise funds from wealthier citizens or the church only contributed to internal divisions. US expansion via the war did exacerbate one of the deepest divisions in the country, though, the question of slavery. An 1850 compromise satisfied neither free nor slaveholding states, and both slaveholders and abolitionists saw opportunities in the new states. Less than 2 decades after the Mexican-American War, veterans like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee would go to war again, this time on opposite sides. The battlefields of the 19th century sparked the imagination of the public through paintings, books, and toys like miniature soldiers. Founded in 1893, W. Britain is one of the oldest toy manufacturers specializing in historical and military figures. With their historically accurate, meticulously researched, hand-painted metal figures, W. Britain allows you to recreate moments of military history. Their catalog includes many different eras. Have a look at General Santana and Mexican soldiers as they were during the Battle of the Alamo. Or what about the Napoleonic Wars? W. Britain offers everything from French Imperial Guard infantry to British units and the Emperor himself. If you're more interested in the American Revolution, the American Civil War, or even World War II, check out their catalog for more military figures, artillery, civilians, and landscape elements. So whatever historical era you're most interested in, W. Britain allows you to recreate it and bring it to life in your own home. For viewers of Real-Time History, W Britain has a special offer. Use the offer code REALTIMEHISTORY to get 10% off your purchase. If you want to learn even more about the history behind the W Britain figures and their equipment, you can join the William Britain Collectors Club and receive your issue of The Standard, the Collectors Club magazine, packed full of fascinating facts and history written by specialist military historians and W Britain collectors. Again, that's offer code REALTIMEHISTORY to get 10% off your purchase. We want to thank W Britain for sponsoring this episode. If you want to learn more about a mid-19th century war with wide-ranging repercussions, check out our documentary about the Crimean War. As usual, you can find all the sources we used in the video description below. And if you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel that also drank enough from the cup of forbearance.